Hello everyone, Professor Kurzluck here. So I wanted to make the next video in our international relations series. So as I talked about in the first video, this can be viewed as maybe an introduction to international relations course. Maybe you are taking an IR course and you're just looking for a little bit of help thinking about or learning about these concepts, or you're just interested in international relations, you're just interested in maybe American foreign policy. So then hopefully this series of videos helps you make sense of that course or that subject. So as I mentioned in the first video, but if you're just tuning into this video, I'm using an Introduction to International Relations, 3rd edition. It's edited by Richard Devertak, Jim George, and Sarah Percy as kind of the guiding textbook. So it can be found online, an Introduction to International Relations, 3rd edition, edited by those authors, Cambridge University Press. So I'm using that as kind of the guiding principle for these videos. So if you're looking to follow along or read, that's the textbook that I am reading from, making notes from. So for today's video, I wanted to introduce and talk about, it'll be a bit of a longer video than I normally make, but talk about one of the major traditions in international relations theory, and that is liberalism. So as you start your international relations journey, you will encounter several theories that help you make sense of the world, or that you can use to help make sense of current events or in things that are going on around you in the world. So it's important, though, to say here at the outset, and it's important to clarify what we mean by liberalism in this context, in this IR context. So in everyday American politics, when you hear the word liberal, if you're hearing this in the American political context, this oftentimes will be referring to a person that is on the left side of the political spectrum. In classes, when we're in class, I joke around like the Bernie Sanders of the American politics, those on the left, a liberal. However, this isn't exactly what we mean here in an international relations setting. In international relations, liberalism refers to a much broader intellectual tradition. It is a way of thinking about politics, international politics, that emphasizes individual rights, constitutional government, the role of law, representative institutions, economic exchange, and the possibility of human progress. When we talk about realism later, we'll see that there's a big difference between liberalism and realism. But for now, when we talk about liberalism in this international relations realm, we are not just talking, and we're not talking about a political party or a policy agenda or what we think of when it comes to maybe American politics. So instead, we are talking about one of the major ways scholars, practitioners, policymakers have tried to understand whether world politics must be dominated by wars, rivalry, and insecurity, which we'll see emerges with realism, or instead cooperation, law, commerce, and institutions can gradually produce a more peaceful world order. And that is the central claim that liberalism tries to answer, or at least the central claim, the central liberal claim that emerges. So with realism, we'll see if realism begins with the problem of power and insecurity, which again we'll talk about in a future video, That realism looks at an anarchic world and there's no global policeman that you can call. Liberalism takes quite a different approach. It begins with a different starting point. Liberals do not deny that conflict exists. They do not deny that states compete with each other. And they certainly do not deny that war has been a major part of international history. However, liberalism asks whether conflict is the only possible outcome of international politics. It asks whether human beings can build institutions, laws, economic relationships, and political systems that actually help reduce the likelihood of violence and instead make cooperation more durable. And so slowly can break down the instances of war. So, in that sense, liberalism is far more optimistic than realism. But it should not simply be dismissed as naive, as sometimes we hear. Liberalism does not say simply that peace happens automatically and that peace is the only thing that will occur if we follow these steps. Instead, it argues, liberals argue, again, not liberals like Bernie Sanders, liberal through the IR sense, argue that peace and cooperation depend on certain political, economic, and institutional conditions. The basic liberal claim is that the structure of domestic governments, the expansion of commerce, the development of international law, and the creation of international institutions can all shape how states behave and can work towards a more peaceful cooperation in a world that doesn't have that global policeman. So liberalism is deeply connected to the political development of the modern West. Its central principles, again, include freedom, human rights, reason, progress, toleration, constitutionalism, and, of course, democracy. These ideas are now so familiar in many Western political systems that they can almost seem natural. However, historically, they were not natural at all. They emerged through long struggles against monarchies and absolutism, religious intolerance, arbitrary rule, and inherited privilege. So one of the major early figures in the tradition was John Locke. Locke argued that individuals possess rights that come before government. In other words, people do not have rights simply because the state chooses to give them those rights. Instead, legitimate government exists to protect rights that individuals already possess. Locke also argued that government should rest on consent, not divine right or inherited authority. So let me repeat that. Locke argued that government should rest on consent. Political power, in this view, must be limited, justified, and, of course, accountable. So that point is central to liberalism. Liberalism begins with the idea that the individually is morally significant. The state matters, but the state is not valuable simply because it is powerful. A state is legitimate when it protects rights, maintains law, governs with some form of consent. So this already separates liberalism from realism. Realists usually began with states as the primary actors in this anarchic international system. Liberals agree that states matter, but they are more interested in what kinds of states they are. Are they constitutional? Are they democratic? Do they protect rights? Are they accountable to citizens? Do they operate under the rule of law? So for liberals, these domestic features matter because they can affect international behavior. Not all states are expected to behave the same way. Regime type thus matters. So in other videos, I made an Iran video and why the U.S. might care if Iran's a democracy. That idea, that question, is heavily rooted in this liberal ideology. So if regime type matters, institutions also matter. Public opinion thus also matters. Norms matter. Economic relationships matter. Liberalism therefore brings domestic politics into the study of international relations in a way that realism simply does not. So over time, liberal thought expanded beyond Locke. Thinkers such as Mary Wollstonecraft and John Stuart Mill pushed liberalism towards broader questions about liberty, equality, inclusion, and individual development. This is important because liberalism was never a single fixed doctrine. It evolved through debates over who counted as a rights-bearing individual. Also about how far freedom should extend and what kinds of political and social arrangements were necessary for people to live freely. So liberalism also emerged alongside capitalism, expanding commerce and Enlightenment ideas about reason and progress. Liberal thinkers came to believe that human history did not have to be permanently tragic or cyclical. Human beings, many early liberal scholars argued, through reason and institutional design, could actually improve their political conditions. This does not mean that liberals simply believe violence can be eliminated easily. You may hear of liberalism as considered as idealist. Maybe that's how your textbook characterizes it. Maybe that's how your professor characterizes it. It's important here to talk, though, that liberals are not saying that conflict can simply just be eradicated easily. But they do reject the idea that war and coercion are the only permanent realities in global, in world politics. So at its strongest, liberalism argues that political problems can be mitigated through law, through representation, again through commerce, education, moral development, and institutional reform. So in other words, the world is not perfect, but it is not fixed either. Political life can be improved. So a useful way to think about or a useful way to understand liberalism in international relations is through two classic examples: peace through law and then peace through commerce. The first idea, peace through law, suggests that roles and institutions can reduce uncertainty among states. If states know the roles, if they have regular channels of communication, and if they participate in institutions that have or that help monitor behavior, then cooperation becomes easier. Law does not eliminate power politics, but it can help restrain it. So the second idea, peace through commerce, suggests that economic interdependence changes the incentives of states. You've probably heard of the democratic peace theory, and this is the idea behind it. When countries trade with one another, invest in one another's countries, and become tied together through production and markets, war becomes less likely because it becomes more costly. If conflict disrupts trade, damages investment, and hurts domestic prosperity, it then states may have stronger incentives to resolve disputes peacefully. One way this used to be talked about, and it was proven wrong, but one way this used to be talked about was the idea that two countries with a McDonald's would never go to war with each other. And maybe I'll make a video on where that idea, where that theory emerged from, and then how it kind of proved not to be true. But the idea that two countries with McDonald's would never go to war with each other is rooted in this idea that there'd be so much economic integration that countries wouldn't dare fight with each other. So that is one of the most important features of liberalism. It is not only a moral theory, it is also an economic and a realistic theory. So thus, it's a kind of a causal theory. It makes arguments about what kinds of arrangements are more likely to produce cooperation. Thus, we know that liberalism suggests that international order is not sustained only by military power or balance of power, which the realists highlight. It can also be sustained by, again, those laws and those markets, that when markets are connected, war is less likely. So I mentioned democratic peace theory. So let's dig into that. One of the most influential modern liberal arguments is the democratic peace theory. In broad terms, democratic peace theory argues that liberal democracies are much less likely to go to war with one another. This does not mean that democracies are always peaceful, though, and that is something to keep in mind. Democracies have fought many, many wars. The more specific claim is that democracies rarely, if ever, fight wars with other democracies. The argument is important because it connects, again, domestic politics, domestic political institutions to international behavior. Democracies are thought to be constrained, again, by the public, by public accountability, by elections, by political competition, constitutional limits, and, of course, of norms. So democratic leaders may find it harder to take their countries to war, especially against other states, because they are seen as partners, maybe economic partners, maybe through trade, or just maybe countries that cooperate. And of course, the domestic pressure would be placed on elected leaders not to go to war. So maybe democracies simply trust each other more. So this idea became especially influential after the Cold War. In the early 90s, after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, many scholars and policymakers believed that liberal democracy had defeated its major ideological rivals. The Soviet Union was gone. That with the Soviet Union gone, the end of history was emerging. So in that context, democratic peace theories seem to offer both an explanation of the past and a guide for the future. If democracies did not fight each other, then spreading democracy appeared to be a path towards a more peaceful world. But this is also kind of where we need to be careful. Our chapter in the reading, the chapter in the textbook that I said at I mentioned at the outset, also does give some criticism. The authors point that the idea of what is a democracy can be challenged, or this idea that democracies are still war prone. They're just saying they're fighting wars against other countries that they are claiming are not democracies. So the reading does highlight that, sure, the democratic peace theory is a well-trusted theory, but it does still have criticisms. And one of those is, what exactly is a democracy? Who gets to dictate what is a democracy? In comparative politics, we spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what makes a democracy? What makes an authoritarian regime? What is a hybrid regime or an electoral regime? So just something that should be thought about when thinking about some of these big theories. So, okay, democratic peace theory, big part. So another key piece of liberalism, second major strand, so democratic peace theory, is neoliberal institutionalism. So this approach, I again made videos about neoliberal institutionalism, liberal institutionalism. This approach is especially important because it does share some assumptions with realism. Neoliberal internationalists accept that the international system is chaotic. There is no world government standing between states, and they also accept that states often pursue their own interests. But they disagree with realists about what follows from those assumptions. So for many realists, anarchy makes cooperation difficult and, of course, fragile because states cannot fully trust one another. Neoliberal institutionalists or liberal institutionalists, but our textbook uses the wording of neoliberal institutionists, but we can say liberal institutionists, just shorthand here, agree that cooperation is difficult, but they argue that it is not impossible and that it is important. States can indeed cooperate when institutions help them manage the problems created by anarchy. So anarchy exists, but liberal institutionalists say we can overcome that anarchy by building institutions. In that way, we are less likely to see conflict. Here, institutions matter because they provide information. They create regular procedures. They create transaction costs. They make expectations more stable. They help states communicate with each other. They make cheating more visible. And they can raise the costs of violating agreements. So in short, institutions make it easier for self-interested states to cooperate. So this is one of liberalism's strongest contributions to international relations theory. Liberalism does not need to pretend that states are always generous or always idealistic. Neoliberal or liberal institutionalism argues that even self-interested states may find cooperation rational when institutions are indeed properly designed. So, an example here would probably help. So think about institutions that we've all heard of, such as the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, the G20. From a liberal institutionalist perspective, these institutions matter not because they eliminate power politics that realists so often talk about, but because they shape the environment in which states pursue their interests. They provide forums for negotiation. They create patterns of repeated interaction. Over time, those patterns can make international politics more predictable and thus more manageable. So, this also connects to the liberal idea of international regimes. A regime, maybe you remember from other political science courses, is broader than a single organization. It includes roles and norms, procedures, expectations, monitoring systems, and informal understandings within a specific issue area. The nuclear nonproliferation regime is the example our textbook uses. It is not just one treaty or one institution. It includes a broader set of agreements, inspection systems, diplomatic purposes, incentives, and shared assumptions about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. So liberal theorists argue that regimes matter because they shape those incentives. They make cooperation easier and defiance or defection more costly. They do not thus eliminate conflict, but they help structure how states, again, manage that conflict. So when we put these ideas together, liberalism, the international relations theory of liberalism, helps us understand the world, helps us make sense of how states interact and why states choose to work together, why they build institutions. So they're still an anarchic world, but instead of states always just trying to have more power than each other or bandwagoning or balance of powering, they build institutions as a way to try to avoid conflict. So that was a broad overview of liberalism, rooted in our reading in An Introduction to International Relations, 3rd edition. So I'll make a couple more videos about liberalism, probably another one on a democratic peace theory, another one about economic integration, which are, as we saw, all pieces of liberal internationalism, all pieces of liberalism. But this video is already almost 30 minutes, and I know it can be tough for people to watch videos with just someone talking to them. So I'll cut it off there, and I'll come back with more videos about liberalism in our series on international relations. Thank you.